Like for most people on this planet, I think 2020 for me was a very strange and unusual year for about 100 reasons. And somewhere on towards the bottom of that list of reasons, maybe somewhere around 95 or 96, what made 2020 so unusual was also the fact that I ended up reading a handful of comics that were actually published in 2020. Now, regular viewers of this channel and people who know me will know that that's very unusual for me because almost always, the vast majority of my year's comics reading is in reading works that were published in years before that. But last year I read about 15 or 16 comics that were actually published in 2020, which is a very high number for me. Two of these comics were Titan, written and drawn by François Vigneault and published by Oni Press, and Under-Earth, written and drawn by Chris Gooch and published by Top Shelf Comics. Both of these comics stayed with me for a while after reading them, the way the best comics do, and I found more similarities between them than just the fact that I read them both in the year that they were published. They were both works of science fiction or speculative fiction. They were both set in very unusual environments, and they both introduced me to their creators. I hadn't read any works by Vigneault or Chris Gooch before this. Well, with Chris Gooch, I read this almost back to back with another book of his, so both of these I consider to be introductory works as far as my experience with these creators is concerned. And although these are very different and distinct works, I also found a number of other things that they had in common. So in this episode of For the Love of Comics, I'd like to talk about two comics that I really enjoyed from last year and talk about a number of things, both thematic and literal, that they have in common. So join me for a closer look at Titan by François Vigneault and Under-Earth by Chris Gooch. Both Titan and Under-Earth are science fiction. Titan is a little more overtly so, being set in space and on Titan, the moon, and Under-Earth is set in a prison colony which is buried miles underneath the earth, where the wastes and dregs of society are just banished to live in these destroyed cities that are deep underground. So out there in space and deep underground on Earth are the settings for these two books. In Titan, you have a Terran, a human from planet Earth, manager arrive at a mining colony that's been there for 100 years and is sort of falling apart in order to boost its productivity and efficiency. In Under-Earth, you have a similar new arrival, a prisoner who is being admitted into the prison, and you see things through his eyes for the first part of the story. And in both these books, this transition happens rather quickly, even though the pacing of Under-Earth is deliberate in a frame by frame, movement by movement, sort of moving across inches, falling. All of these things are given to you at a very deliberate pace. The fish out of water element is quickly balanced by the prisoners in Under-Earth seeming to have their own civilization and their own society. In Titan, you have incredible distances covered in just a very short period of time as the narrative quickly takes you onto the surface of this moon. The manager arrives on the moon of Titan to find tensions brewing between the Terran human population and the genetically engineered giants, Titans of the moon Titan, who have been engineered by the humans to do manual labor and to work these mines. These simmering tensions between these groups automatically start giving you a very colonialism and capitalism tinged story in which the working of these mines and the exploitation of this labor and what their issues are, as well as the kind of biases and prejudices that people have within them, immediately tell you, the reader, that this isn't just a sci-fi jaunt or adventure. The story has more serious things on its mind. Similarly, Under-Earth presents another stratified society, this one populated all people by prisoners who are sort of just been abandoned in these ruined cities deep underground to create their own systems and laws outside of the laws that are sort of guarding them and supervising them in these scavenging hunts that they go on. In fact, the economy and the bartering systems of this world seem very similar to things that we've read about in war-torn stories or prisoner of war stories or even prison movies, which this actually feels a lot like, just on a much more bleak and epic scale. Both Titan and Under-Earth do an amazing job of immediately putting you and me, the readers, into these very alien and very odd worlds. They don't waste a lot of time getting you caught up into the way things function. In the case of Titan, in the form of a female liaison from the Titans, a humongous woman who's assigned to handle the manager and serve as a person who communicates between the two groups. The management and military versus the manual labor genetically engineered giants. In Under-Earth, you have a similar guide figure in the form of a veteran prisoner who, in spite of himself, takes under his wing this sort of weakling new arrival who would otherwise perish without him, is the sense we get. But Under-Earth is also divided into two stories. You have the parallel story alongside this new arrival and this veteran of these two girls, these two women who have been here for a while and are trying to look for a way out, and the kind of machinations that they get up to in order to grasp at straws at any possibility of escape. You've got these parallel stories of oppression and trying to either familiarize yourself with it or get out of it happening in this prison land, which to me reminded me of a lot of stories I've seen, but was also very fresh and unusual because of the bleakness of its landscape, the things that it has married together. Titan doesn't have a parallel story, but it does have those two sides where you've got one person representing the Terrans, one person representing the Titans, and them not being completely sold on the group that they represent. One of the most interesting things about Titan was that this Terran figure does feel, because probably of his power and his authority, that he can solve things and fix things, but the story isn't really about him being the savior. It focuses wonderfully on the relationship between these two, in which the roles of who's in charge and who has power are very interestingly flipped from moment to moment and from incident to incident. What this Titan liaison feels about her world and what she's looking for and why she's interested in what this Terran has to offer her, as well as the manager obviously looking for any advantage that he has. All of these things are happening very subtly in this story that actually ends up being a sort of love story. The relationships in Under-Earth are never overtly love stories, but you can't help but feel the kinds of bonds that are forming in these characters as well. On one side, you have a relationship that is fraught with a betrayal and a larger forgiveness. Another relationship is all about extreme levels of loyalty, no matter what the risk to yourself is concerned. These are the central relationships playing out against this larger drama of this prison world and mafia bosses and black market goods, which I thought were terrific twin stories to help us explore this world, because we're essentially still talking only about these characters in spite of getting this larger and larger stage being unveiled to us. In the case of Titan, the larger repercussions around the tensions that are building in this one station become very clear until you get this classic situation where it's about these two people and they alone can stop what might otherwise become a war or a series of violence that spreads not just across this moon but across the solar system. But in both these books, what I really appreciated was that the adventure or the high adrenaline sequences never overtake the emotional core, which is always about a particular relationship. Both of these books give you complex characters in dire circumstances, but take very different approaches in how they do so. Titan has an art style that can properly be described as funky. The figures of both the Terrans as well as the Titans are cartoonish, but are capable of evoking incredible empathy. On the other hand, Under-Earth has simplistic, almost plain drawings that do a fantastic job of conveying starkness. And again, the human relationship and emotions are never in doubt, even though you don't have a dozen lines crowding all over the place. The writing in both these books is very accomplished, but in very different ways. In Titan, François Vigneault seems to understand certain tropes of science fiction adventure stories and wants to play with them while also talking about things like capitalism and things like commerce, but at the same time understanding this star-crossed lovers at the middle of two humongous forces kind of fairy tale storytelling. He makes some very interesting choices with the plot that kept me guessing and has an ending that doesn't really go where you think the story is going. And the same goes double for Under-Earth, which creates an ending for each of its 4 characters that is completely surprising yet feels absolutely right. It's funny that when I started thinking about these 2 books together, I kept finding more and more things that I could just cosmetically group together, like how both of them have very interesting duotone color schemes. There's a hot pink look to Titan that makes you feel the alienness of this moon, strange light. It's very effectively done. Under-Earth actually has 2 different color schemes for its parallel stories that tend to overlap and intersect at certain times, which keeps you very clear as far as which thread you're following. One of them, this black and white and yellow, that reminded me of Box Brown and Tetris in particular. The other one, a gray-blue. There's a special presence for gladiatorial combat in both stories. But to me, the biggest similarities between these works is the fact that they both feel very accomplished. Their creators seem to know exactly what they wanted to do and were able to do it very well. What you think of it will obviously vary from person to person, but you don't think that there's anything accidental or anything sloppy in either of these books, even though their styles and approaches are so very different. They're also both very interested in the very personal, individual human relationships in spite of having the backdrop or the environment that feels epic or expansive, and they're both extremely good at creating that world not only rapidly for the reader, but having that world as a backdrop function to heighten the emotional connections we have with their characters. In fact, both of these books felt like they would be great companion pieces to Pat Grant's The Grot, a book that I had talked about earlier this year. Is another book that was published in 2020 that I actually read in 2020. But just like The Grot, which was interested in individuals functioning within this larger machine of economic and exploitative behavior, just like that, I thought Titan and Under-Earth were very interesting reads of speculative fiction, books that were mired in some pulp traditions but were still interested in being very modern and very incisive about human relationships while using those familiar tropes. Titan, I believe, was previously published in French but published in English for the first time last year. Under-Earth was published in November of last year, and I can strongly recommend both Titan and Under-Earth as well as The Grot to anyone who's interested in how an independent vision on more popular concepts can bring about really interesting human comics stories. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different way of looking at 2 new comics. I'd love, as always, to have your questions and comments below. This has been For the Love of Comics. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.